Thank you very much. It is, I feel very privileged to be invited to speak by the Menokin Foundation and Mount Airy about my book, since it deals, half of it is concerned with Mount Airy and the Mount Airy slaves. I have this handout, and I will talk about this toward the end of my talk. But I thought it would be useful for everyone in the room to have a copy of it. So I hope you all do. If not, there are some extra ones here. My book, A Tale of Two Plantations, I've worked on it for about 40 years, off and on, starting in the 1970s, which is too long. I readily admit that. First of all, I couldn't really figure out how to shape it up into a coherent whole until I'd worked on it for many years. And I kept on finding new interesting things the more I dug into my material, and that kept me going. Now, this book is regrettably long and complex, but its message, its basic message, is short and simple. I compare slave life on two plantations, Mesopotamia Sugar Estate in western Jamaica, and Mount Airy Plantation in the northern neck of Virginia, right here. And I do this in order to demonstrate the huge differences between the British Caribbean and the U.S. slave systems. And the most fundamental difference, in my opinion, was demographic. And I try to emphasize this throughout the book. You may not all be fully aware that in the African slave trade, the Atlantic trade that brought over 10 million Africans into enslavement in America, there were 12 people who were sent to the Caribbean for every one person that was sent to what is now the United States. It's a huge, huge difference, especially since very quickly the population, the black population in the United States, or what was then the 13 colonies, was larger than in the Caribbean. And the reason for this is demographic. There was continuous population loss in the Caribbean. There were always more deaths than births, and therefore people had to, in order to keep things going, the planters got more slaves from Africa. On the other hand, there was vigorous population growth in North America, and I argue that this situation actually caused terrible suffering for the enslaved people in both regions. Both the population loss, which is pretty obvious, and the population growth, which is perhaps less obvious. Now, I know that people in this room are far more interested in Mount Airy than in Mesopotamia. That's obvious. But my purpose is to demonstrate that slave life was strikingly different in the two places, and so I will talk today about both plantations. And to set the stage, here are a few pictures. This is Mesopotamia as it looks today. It's a working sugar farm. There are no evidences of slave days. There's no great house for the owner. There's no sugar mill, no boiling house, no rum distillery, no slave huts. There are slave graves, but they haven't been found. When I went there, I wanted to, I knew that I couldn't find slave graves, but I thought maybe I could find the graves of some of the white people who operated the place in the 18th and early 19th centuries. And so I was taken to an enclosure, a sort of a jungle inside barbed wire. that was the graveyard. And I was led through the barbed wire, and I found myself entangled in undergrowth, not knowing what to do. And I could see a grave at some distance, but I couldn't see how to get to it. And then I realized I was standing on what seemed like a tabletop, and so I must be standing on a grave. And so my companions got out their machetes and they chopped away, and we exposed the grave. And it's probably impossible for you to see, but there is the word Barum there. The Barums were the owners of Mesopotamia. And down in the bottom, right by my companion's shoe, there's 1735. So this is a grave from 1735. So that's the sort of situation that I found in Mesopotamia. Now you all know what Mount Airy looks like. Here we have a total contrast, because when I visited Mount Airy and met the Tayloe family, of course I found a family still living in the house that had been built in the 1750s, a magnificent Palladian villa, and we'll all be there this afternoon. Again, no evidences of past slavery, but very evident evidences of a plantation system that once had been from the top down. Now, you may well ask, why Mesopotamia and Mount Airy? When I started this project 40 years ago, I guess I've got another picture here of the garden side of Mount Airy. Beautiful building. So when I started this project, I was looking for two sets of plantation records that would illustrate population loss in the Caribbean, which I knew took place, and population gain in the US. And I thought if I could find two plantations, they wouldn't have to be representative of all plantations, but they would have to show population loss on the one hand, population gain on the other, and what this meant for the slaves. Now, after considerable searching, I found in England at the Bodleian Library at Oxford the records for Mesopotamia. And then I wanted to find something comparable, and I looked in South Carolina, North Carolina, Maryland, and finally in Virginia, in the Virginia Historical Society, I found the Tayloe papers, and that was exactly the comparison I wanted. These two sets of records could play together. But the thing that I noticed immediately, and the main reason why this has taken 40 years, is that these records were so rich. Here is a page from a Mesopotamia inventory of 1793. And that inventory, like all the others at Mesopotamia, is listed alphabetically. At the very top, you might be able to see the 140th male slave, whose name is Zell. And he's 34, he's a field worker, and he's able. The third woman on the list is Atty, who is the heroine of my chapter 2. And she is 25, she's a field worker, and she's able. But if you look down the last list, you'll see that plenty of people who are not able. Somebody is very sickly, another is consumptive, another is infirm, another is an invalid. And that is a good example of the way the Mesopotamia inventories look. These people had many health problems, and death was ever present. Then if you turn to Mount Airy, this is from the first complete inventory. There's an inventory for 1808, but it's incomplete. But the inventory for 1809 is the first complete one. Now this is not listed alphabetically, it's listed by occupation, but more important, there's an inventory for the slaves who lived right around the Great House, the house we'll be visiting. And then there were a series of 6 or 7 inventories for the farm quarters, where the field hands lived and worked. But here you start on the left side there with house servants, and the top person is Archie, who's 38 years old, I think, and is valued at 80 pounds. They don't give a state of health, but they give a price, so that you can see carpenters over on the right side. So these two sets of records are organized differently, but the great thing is that if you have consecutive inventories, annual inventories, you can actually piece a single person's life together as long as you have 3 things: name, occupation, and age. Age is crucial because there might be 10 people named John, but if you have the ages of each one of them and the occupations, you can separate them and you can work out an actual skeletal biography of a person over, in many cases, over that person's entire life. So I was able, thanks to these inventories, to track 1,103 people, slaves, who lived at Mesopotamia in a 70-year period, 1762 to 1833. And 973 people who lived at Mount Airy between 1809 and 1863. That's over 2,000 people. And I saw the tantalizing possibility of trying to bring some of these people actually to life. Now, at Mesopotamia, we have the Barham family. There were 2 Barhams, Joseph Foster Barham and his son Joseph Foster Barham II, who operated the plantation during the 70 years I'm interested in. And during this period, there were 331 more deaths than births among the slaves. So to keep the plantation going, the Barhams bought 415 replacement slaves, some directly from Africa and some from local Jamaican plantations. The situation is reversed at Mount Airy. Now that we've already heard about John Tayloe III. He took over in 1792, and his son, William Henry Tayloe, continued through the Civil War. And those 2 Tayloes, during their time span, there were 293 more births than deaths. So there were always surplus slaves, and the Tayloes took full advantage of this by moving 329 people to distant work sites, and selling another 99 people to new owners. So the way I look at it and the way I argue it, the Mesopotamia slaves were victimized by continuous disease and death, while the Mount Airy slave families were routinely ripped apart. Now you can see that the Mount Airy inventories start much later than the Mesopotamia ones, which might seem bad, but the fact is that slavery ended 30 years earlier in Jamaica than in Virginia, ended in 1834 instead of 1865. So really what I have is the last 3 generations of slavery on both plantations. And that's really the kind of comparison I want to make. What was it like to be a slave during the last 60 or 70 years of slavery in these 2 communities? And what I argue is that Mesopotamia, the slaves were trapped within a collapsing system which was working less and less well, and the Mount Airy slaves were trapped within an expanding system which actually was getting stronger and stronger. The Caribbean slaveholders had been, I think, at peak strength in the middle of the 18th century down to around 1807, when the slave trade to Africa was stopped by the British government. And that caused a real problem because they could no longer replace slaves from Africa. The only way they could replace diminishing populations was to buy slaves from other Jamaica plantations that were going under, and that's what happened. And this meant that when Parliament voted in 1833 to abolish slavery, the Caribbean slaveholders were outraged, but they couldn't do much about it. They had to accept it, especially when they were offered 20 million pounds in recompense. And so the slaves were emancipated in the British West Indies without a struggle. But as you well know, in the U.S. system, the slavery gained steadily in strength and in geographical spread between 1800 and 1860, and it took 4 years of ferocious civil war to free the slaves in the Confederate South. I'd like to show you another way of looking at this. I have two I have a comparison here between the composition of the slave force in the two places. In Mesopotamia, just about exactly half of the people who entered the slave force between 1762 and 1833, just about half of them were born there. And the people who were born there actually obviously had mothers, and they generally knew their fathers, and they had siblings, they had families. But about a third came from other Jamaican properties. They were bought generally in rather large groups of 40 or 50, and some of them came as families, but others came as singles. And then when you look at the Africans, they all came as singles. They had no family connections whatsoever before they came to Mesopotamia. Now, you might be surprised at the small number of Africans, but that's one place where Mesopotamia was very unusual, because the owners, the barons, disliked the slave trade, and they stopped buying slaves in 1792, well before the end of the slave trade, and therefore they had fewer African-born slaves in their population than most Jamaican plantations. Here, by contrast, is Mount Airy. The first thing to notice is that every single one of these people was born in Virginia. There are no African-born people from 1808 onward. Probably the Tayloes stopped getting any slaves from Africa by 1750. They had no need to, because their population was always expanding. And 86% were born on the estate, and the other 14% came from other Tayloe units. John Tayloe III, who, as I say, took over in 1792, was one of the very largest slaveholders in Virginia or in the USA. He had about 700 slaves on many different properties, and about half of them at Mount Airy. And one of the things I'm really upset about is that the very first thing that John Tayloe did when he took charge as a young man, 21-year-old man, was to advertise that he had 200 slaves for sale, Virginia-born slaves. But there are no records that I can find of the sales. I know that he sold over 100. He didn't sell 200. And he certainly cut his slave force down from about 380 to about 260. But through natural growth, the slave population was back to 380 by the time the first inventory was taken in 1808. I'm going to just take a little water here. Now, when you look at the two slave populations year by year, you can see how they changed in size, in age structure, and gender balance. So I'm going to show you rather quickly three profiles. This is the way things looked in 1762 in Mesopotamia. And from a practical point of view, almost everything is bad here. The women are on the right, the men are on the left. There are too few women to produce children in the future. There are very few children. It's supposed to be, a population pyramid is supposed to be wide at the bottom and go to a peak. This goes to a peak, but there are more people in their 40s than in their teens. And so it's an overage workforce and with little potential for future growth. Now, when the first Baron died in 1789, this is the way things looked. Very, very different, because he and his agents had bought about 100 new slaves right after the American Revolution. The population had shrunk down to close to 200, not much more than 200, and then it was expanded suddenly to 300, and the people who came in were all young. So you suddenly had a very vigorous, effective workforce, but you still had very few children and too few females. And this is the final picture, the last inventory, and it shows something closer to a pyramid. There are more children. There are actually more women than men now, because the women tended to live longer than the men. But again, there are a lot of old people and not many of prime working age. So I argue that for the most part, Mesopotamia had a poorly shaped population for the very hard physical labor of sugar production. Now you have a different situation in Mount Airy. This is the first full inventory in 1809, and it does show a real pyramid. But it's obviously not a perfect pyramid. There are holes in it, and these holes, I think, are attributable to the fact that John Tayloe III tended to, if he was going to sell people, and he did sell, as I say, over 100 people in the 90s, in the 1790s, he tended to sell females, especially young girls, before they were old enough to have their first children. And he would also move a great many people to other work sites. So what you have in 1809 is a somewhat jagged pattern, but there's obviously a tremendous potential for population growth. And here's how things looked 20 years later when John Tayloe III died. It's a pyramid, but with more holes. But that's because he's moved a tremendous number of people out of Mount Airy to other work sites. He now has, he ended up with 12 children, 7 of whom were male, all of whom wanted to have their own slave forces when they became adults. So he was setting up new places for these, for his sons, with working largely from his Mount Airy population. And then here's how things looked in the middle of the Civil War under his son William Henry Tayloe. There are about 460 people in this pyramid. The ones in white in the middle, both male and female, are the only ones who are still at Mount Airy. The ones in black have all been moved to Alabama, and the ones in the darker shading are the children of in Alabama of Mount Airy slaves who've been moved there. But what you can see is an even more vigorous growth. I mean, this is a perfect illustration of how the Tayloes always had surplus slaves to put to use. When you examine the situation person by person instead of year by year, you get biographical information for all the slaves, and it is sometimes possible to tease out more satisfying documentation about individual men and women. And I illustrate this in chapters 2 and 3. Chapter 2 deals with the Mesopotamia family. And up toward the top is Sarah Apper. She was first known as Appy, but then baptized into the Moravian Church as Sarah Apper. And she had 6 children. Something seems to have happened to the side, right, the left side there, but she had 4 black children and 2 mulatto children, Robert and Anne. And then Anne, in turn, had quite a mix of children, but they included Jane Ritchie down at the bottom left, who is a quadroon. We know who Robert's father was. He was a bookkeeper named McAlpin, and we don't know about Anne's father, but that was probably the same guy. And then we know that Jane Ritchie was the daughter of Dr. Ritchie, the slave doctor. So what I try to do here, there's a great deal, obviously, of racial mixing going on in this family, but I also try to compare Sarah, who was a field worker, with her mulatto son Robert, who was a cooper, a much better job, but he was a very angry man. He had ferocious fights, and he actually ended up, 2 of his adversaries died. They were both black people. And then Jane, in the next generation, Sarah's granddaughter, was a domestic who actually managed to outmaneuver a pair of Moravian missionaries and succeeded in driving them out of the plantation. She's the most successful, slave achievement that I found in Mesopotamia. So you have this sort of generation by generation contrast. And then turning to Mount Airy, I tell the story of Winnie Grimshaw and her family. Her grandparents, Harry and Winnie Jackson, were among the favorite slaves of John Tayloe III and his wife, Anne. Harry was a coachman and Winnie was a chambermaid. And they accompanied the Tayloes when they went back and forth to Washington to stay during the winter at the Octagon, and then in the summer at Mount Airy. And the Jacksons produced a daughter, Esther, who married Bill Grimshaw, who became the chief carpenter at Mount Airy. But when Bill Grimshaw ran away and got all the way to Canada, William Henry Tayloe, this was in 1845, William Henry Tayloe responded, as he always did, by breaking up the family. So he didn't do anything with Lizzie on the extreme left because she was in Washington working for William Henry Tayloe's mother, who lived at the Octagon. But the others, Anne and Juliet, were separately sold. Charlotte died. Esther, the mother, and Henry, the youngest child, were sold. And that just left James and our heroine, Winnie, and they were sent down to Alabama, 800 miles away. And once Winnie got to Alabama, she became the housekeeper for a white overseer named Richard Donahan, and she had 5 mulatto children by him over a period of about a decade. And then during the Civil War, the son of another overseer was the father of her last mulatto child, Thornton. So once again, you have racial mixing, but in certainly a different social setting. Now, I think one of the most interesting things that I can show you is childbearing, especially in Mesopotamia. There are actually more women of childbearing age at Mesopotamia than at Mount Airy. And that's because the Tayloes were in the habit of sending so many of the young girls away before they were old enough to have children. But when you look at this more closely, you see that more than half of the Mesopotamian women had absolutely no children, no recorded live births during a 70-year period. And most of the children, the families they did have were small. But on the other hand, there were 6 women in Mesopotamia who produced families of 7 to 14 children. So it was possible in Mesopotamia to have a huge family, but for more than half the women, no family. Then when you look at from the point of view of the children, there are obviously more children born at Mount Airy, and you can see that a very sizable number of them came from very large families, 7 to 14 children. Now, we'll be talking later about the robust family development in Mount Airy, but I want to spend a little time asking why it was that half the women more than half the women at Mesopotamia had no children. And I believe that the chief reason was heavy physical labor in the sugar fields, because most of the field workers were female. And from 1800 on, I can demonstrate from my inventories that there always were more women than men in the first field gang, the one that did the very hardest work, that dug the cane holes, that cut the cane. There were always more women than men in that gang, and they worked in pairs, so there must have been a number of occasions in which there were 2 women doing this brutal work, so you can't say that the men were doing it. And they worked about 60 hours a week during a regular season, and during crop time they could work up to 90 hours a week, and because the sugar mill kept on going 24 hours a day. But there are other factors. The slaves were disease-ridden, as we've seen, and malnourished. The malnourishment is important. They had to produce their own food. They had their own slave provision grounds, but during crop time, they didn't have any time in which to work these grounds, with the consequence that every summer there was a starvation period. And I think that some women were unable to ovulate or menstruate, and others may have practiced abortion. That's certainly possible, but I don't believe that half the women were practicing abortion. I'm inclined to put more emphasis on labor and diet and disease. Now at Mount Airy, where you have robust family growth, it's clear that the slaves were in much better physical shape. They had a much more substantial and much more nutritious diet. And they did work very long and very hard, but their labor was less debilitating than at Mesopotamia. Now, to look again at Mesopotamia, I can find out quite a lot about religion on this estate, whereas I can find out almost nothing about religion at Mount Airy. And what I found was that the absentee owner, Joseph Foster Barham, supported a Moravian mission on the estate, and that mission operated all during the time of my study. Started in 1758, ended in 1836. And about a third of the slaves were entered the church, were baptized into the church. But that wasn't easy, because the Moravian missionaries had to get the permission of the Savior, as they called him, or Jesus Christ. And the only way they could do that was they would pray to him, and then they would use a ballot box. So they put in a 3 papers saying yes, no, and maybe, and find out what the Savior wanted by picking that button. And you can see that the Savior said no very quickly. So that Appy, who is the heroine of chapter 2, she appears there twice. And actually, it took 3 times before she could become a candidate for baptism, and another 6 times before she could become actually baptized, and the whole process took 6 years. So she was a candidate for conversion for 6 years. The other interesting thing about this, which fits into what I'll next talk about, is that most of the members of the church were female and elderly. And that's not very surprising. You would expect such people to be interested in salvation. But always the church was led and dominated by the so-called head people, the field drivers, the sugar boilers, the rum distillers, the craftsmen. And on the other hand, the male field workers especially didn't join. There was never very many of them in the church. What they did do, what the male field workers did do, was run away. And I have records of 140 of these slaves who were identified as runaways, and many of them were gone for a long time. They would turn up in workhouses 50 miles away from Mesopotamia. And during the years 1826, 1831, as we're getting close to the end of slavery, a quarter of the field hands were running away. And then in 1831-32, there was a huge slave rebellion in western Jamaica, the biggest in Jamaican history and far bigger than any slave rebellion in the U.S. More than 100 sugar plantations were set on fire, and the rebellion quickly spread into the neighborhood of Mesopotamia, forcing the 6 white managers to depart on militia duty. And I think that many of the field hands must have wanted to join the rebellion, but they couldn't because the head people took control. Leading members of the Moravian congregation captured 2 rebels, guarded the plantation, and conducted the sugar harvest without any white supervision for a month. Now, at Mount Airy, I also found a division, the same sort of division, with the field hands on the one hand and the craft and domestic slaves on the other. And the craft and domestic slaves I see as the equivalent of the head people in Mesopotamia. But here, the craft and domestic workers were much more likely to rebel than the field hands, despite the fact that most of the slaves who were sold or moved by the Tayloes were field hands. John Tayloe, for instance, sent 49 people to work in an iron furnace in the Blue Ridge Mountains, 200 miles away, and 80% of those people were field hands. And in 1816, here you have a list of this, he sold 26 people for $7,200. And again, all but 2 of these people came from the farm quarters. And then the most conspicuous example of this is that William Henry Tayloe, his son, between 1833 and 1854, sent 120 Mount Airy slaves to work on his cotton plantations in Alabama, 800 miles away. And again, 80% of them were field hands. Now, I don't believe that they went in coffles because I have numerous descriptions of how they were eager to go and they were unrestrained. But they did have to walk 800 miles. They walked about 20 miles a day. It took 40 to 45 days for them to get there, and about 1/5 of them were sold on arrival. I feel that at Mount Airy, and as generally in the U.S., rebellion was much harder than at Mesopotamia. Anyone who challenged the master by running away or similar disobedience was sold and his family was broken up. But there were about 40 Mount Airy people who did run away or who did rebel during my time period, and a great majority of them were craft workers or domestics. I think that's interesting. The most spectacular case was a laundry maid named Lizzie Flood, who set fire to the Mount Airy mansion in 1844 and destroyed the interior of the building. And the following year, as I've said, carpenter Bill Grimshaw escaped to Canada, and during the Civil War, 13 Mount Airy slaves fled to the Yankees, and 10 of them were craft workers or domestics. And these were, of course, the people who knew the Tayloes best and served them personally, but they were also the people who were probably best informed about what was going on and what the possibilities were for action. Now, finally, I want to focus just a little bit, I hope I've still got a little bit of time, on family life, especially in Mount Airy. I've constructed family trees for 3, 4, even 5 generations on both plantations. And I have a website, which I hope a few of you may have looked at, and if you haven't, I urge you to do so. It's listed there, www.twoplantations.com, and this website presents mini-biographies of 431 slaves from the two plantations, and it tries to show a dramatic difference between family life in the two places. Because at Mount Airy we find mothers with huge extended families. Now, I'm not going to show you the actual website because it's too complicated to open it up, but here is a scan of a chart that I drew of Sally Thurston and her family. This chart is over 5 feet long. I stitched it together with Scotch tape. And on the website, you can move it back and forth. So you can see all 114 people on the website. And you'll notice that a great many of them are circled in green to Ala. Those are the people who were sent down to Alabama between 1833 and 1862. But if you can compare this with the situation in Mesopotamia, here is a lady, Minnie, a domestic who had the largest family on record in Mesopotamia, larger than any family in Mount Airy. She had 14 children. But 4 of them died in infancy, another 5 died young, 1 was manumitted. So there were only 4 left by the end of slavery in 1834, and only 2 grandchildren, because of those 5 grandchildren, the first 3 were all dead. And I'd just like to pause on the last grandchild, Quadroon Richard Ridgard, because I recently received an email from a lady in England who told me that her great-great-grandfather was Richard Ridgard. And she'd always supposed that he was a Scot who somehow came to Jamaica, but she couldn't figure this out. There didn't seem to be any evidence for it. And when she looked at my book and my website, she found the reason. The Scot was William Ridgard, Richard's father, and he was the attorney for the Barhams. He lived in the Great House. Fanny Fisher, Richard's mother, was a mulatto housekeeper and also presumably a bedmate. And so Richard Ridgard was born into slavery, but quickly, 1834, he was free. And he, I understand, became a fisherman and at Savannah, Lamar, the port town, and lived until 1905. So I do have at least one connection from Mesopotamia slavery to the present. And I'm hopeful that I may possibly find some kind of connection for Mount Airy people. And that's why I brought this I have this handout. I know the surnames that slaves gave themselves or were given that appeared in the records in the 1850s and 60s. And they are all listed there in the first column. And the ones in boldface are on my website. And they're identified by website family, so you can find them. And also, I found about half of the 460 people who were freed in 1865, I found in the 1870 census. And they are listed in the third column as to whether they were found in living in Alabama or living in Virginia, or in two cases in the District of Columbia. And I note on the back over 150 Mount Airy slaves with these surnames can be found, appear in my book and can be traced in the index. But if anyone in this room or who knows of somebody else with one of these names, I urge them to look at the website, and if they're not in the website, if they're not in boldface, to get in touch with me, and I may be able to tell you more about their family backgrounds. This becomes important when we discuss emancipation. Once again, there's a big difference between emancipation in Mount Airy and in Mesopotamia. In Mesopotamia, the freed people quickly abandoned their sugar plantation. By the mid-1840s, I believe there were very few or none of them still working there. And instead they had contract laborers from India. What the Mesopotamia people did was to acquire small plots of uncultivated land in Jamaica, and they became independent peasant farmers. But there's no real record of them. I can't track any of them, but I know that in general that's what happened. But in Mount Airy, you have an entirely different situation. The land is all taken up. There is no uncultivated land. So when the slaves were freed and they wanted to have their own land, they couldn't get it. Now, when they were freed, 400 of the 460 were living on two cotton plantations, Larkin and Oakland in Alabama. And the interesting thing that I think I can illustrate with my final two slides is I can see through the story of Richard Yateman. Richard Yateman was a gardener at Mount Airy. He worked as a gardener for about 30 years into his mid-40s. And we can tell from some of the work logs at Mount Airy the sort of work he did. And he and his wife Sally had 12 children. The three youngest died. One of the others was sold, but the other 8 were all alive when the family was sent down to Alabama in 1861-62. And here's Richard himself, his mini-biography, one of 431 on my website. He and all the 8 people in his family left Larkin Plantation at the end of 1865 in the hope of finding something better. And by 1870, they were back. And this was the general pattern. Richard and Sally and their youngest children lived in one cabin. The 2 oldest sons, both married, had 2 other cabins, and they were all together. The family was sticking together. There were 2 daughters I can't trace. They had probably married, and hence no longer had that surname. But what I can see is this coming together. And it wasn't just a family coming together, it was the whole community coming together. On Oakland, there was only one of the 26 cabins occupied by a non-Tayloe ex-slave. In other words, they were all living together and they were keeping other people out. They wanted companionship and bonding. And I believe the reason they did this was not from any love of the Tayloes, but to band together in black community solidarity against the white mob violence that was erupting by 1870 in Alabama. So that's where I have to end. I can get to 1870 with Mount Airy, but I can't get any further. But I hope that maybe other people can carry on the story. And meanwhile, I end with these people with the death of slavery and the birth of freedom. Thank you.